Okay, I think it's time to start us up. Justin's had a fresh cup of tea in his soccer mug. I call it soccer now that I'm living here in New York. So, hi everyone, I'm Charlie Osmond. I'm the Chief Tees at Trip Tees, and welcome to this webinar. I'm really excited because Justin has joined us. Justin was one of the top speakers at the Direct Booking Summit this year in Dallas. A lot of great feedback from everyone who attended, and so we asked if he'd come back and talk a little bit more for a wider audience, for those of you who weren't able to make it to the Direct Booking Summit. And one of the reasons I think that people found what Justin had to say so interesting was because he comes from with a unique perspective. So many people in the hospitality industry seem to have been in the hospitality industry from the moment they got out of diapers. There's a lot of people who grew up in hotels and stick in the industry, and sometimes it's really useful to I guess hear from people who've come from another walk of life and made a shift into hotels. Particularly, I think that's useful and valuable when we're talking about digital and driving direct and websites, because there's a huge amount that hoteliers can learn, we think, from outside the industry. So I will be quiet now, shut up, and let Justin introduce himself, who comes from a extraordinary background of entrepreneurialism and product management and digital development into hoteling. So Justin, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. This is always a pleasure to work with the Trip Tees folks. And yeah, my background's a little bit weird. Back in my very first digital product days, I was in the music industry in the early 2000s, and we went through a major crisis in that era of streaming audio and had to adapt very quickly to use technology to drive revenues in different ways. And it was a very scary time. And then I transitioned over into retail, which went through its own crisis of brick and mortar versus online sales. And so there was a unique tension there between trying to drive revenues through online channels while also preserving brick and mortar. And so that was an interesting season. And since then, I've moved into things like fintech and health tech, and a number of high-tech startups where we all apply the process I'm going to be talking about today, evidence-based design, where we use very clear, very specific framework for how we would choose what programs and products and features that we would spend our time and energy and money on bringing to market. And in the case of like startups, sometimes they're completely new ideas that the industry is just not aware of. And as I've transitioned into the hospitality industry, run into a lot of unique challenges that I've really enjoyed trying to tackle. I think it's worth calling out that I work with a very large firm in Las Vegas. We have something like 10,000 rooms on a single integrated resort campus. Our environment that we're working in might be very different than yours. And so one, I think the most probably clear one is that we have thousands of transactions a week on our website, and that lets us do a lot of very targeted A/B testing and optimization stuff. And so we have a survey that we've asked, and Charlie, you may have to help direct folks where to answer that. But I'd love to get a sense of the folks that are on the call today to understand what, where you come from, what kind of, how big of a firm, a hotel that you're working with. And this will kind of help me tailor what I'm speaking to, because if a lot of folks here are, have less than 1,000 transactions a week, for example, I want to make sure I'm giving you solid ideas for how you can tailor your specific plan and how you might apply evidence-based design. So I'll give folks a few minutes to kind of click on that. It's just a yes or no question. If you have, does your hotel booking engine have greater than 1,000 transactions per week? The reason this is really important is because a lot of the testing methodologies that we use vary significantly based on how many transactions flow through a website. If that ends up being, do I need to turn my screen back on, Charlie?
Yep, sorry, yeah.
Oh, so good. Oh, what did the results come back? Did you already see them?
We have them, yes. So a quarter of people have over 1,000 transactions on their website a week, and 3/4 do not.
Okay, great. Well, so for you larger firms, stay tuned. A lot of these processes are absolutely applicable to you. But hearing that we've got 3/4 of the folks that are in, that aren't going to be able to do 1,000 transactions per week, I'm going to kind of tailor some of these recommendations and talking points around how to best apply some of these approaches with smaller, fewer transactions. So, and again, that's really important, and Charlie can speak to this in a lot more detail probably, but when we're doing A/B testing, it's really important that we are able to get to meaningful statistical significance as quickly as possible. I mean, ideally, of course, we could run a test and know the results in a matter of days, but if you have fewer than 1,000 transactions, it can take one test even a couple of months to run before you get to statistical significance. So it's not to say that you shouldn't do A/B testing. It just means that you need to approach that with a different set of strategies. So I'm going to be speaking to some of those now. Let me reshare my screen real fast.
Cool. While you do that, I'll just pick up from there. I know one of the things that we see, or we advise hotels who have smaller numbers of transactions to do, is spend more time, with qualitative research. So, for example, if you haven't got many transactions, then going into Starbucks with your laptop and asking someone to book your hotel and give them a credit card, and just listening to them talk through what they're thinking, what they're seeing as they do it, is actually a really effective research methodology that can help you identify all sorts of issues, all sorts of opportunities to improve. But you're doing it with an audience of one. Maybe better to take 4, 5, 6 people, but you can do it with very small numbers and still get value. So it's really about, as you're saying, the right testing methodology for the right audience. Anyway, so maybe I'll just quickly tee you up for what's coming next. So you're going to talk us a bit about the processes the process you've used in your former lives and now also apply in your hotel life around evidence-based design.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to walk you all through very quickly the overall arching framework of what evidence-based design is, and talk through some case studies that we actually, where we have some data that I could show you around how certain tests that we've run will work. And then I'll segue into some testing strategies for whether you've got a very large amount of volume or small amount of volume. So evidence-based design, there are a number of frameworks that you could apply, but I prefer evidence-based design. It actually comes from the medical industry, and where there were doctors actually running tests within a hospital around the physical space. And this was in the late 70s, early 80s, where some of these tests began to, they were actually applying this process. And so this comes from a medical high level of research-based approach. But as I've worked with various startups and large retail firms and in other industries, we applied very similar approaches to what we were going to do and how we were going to test it. So let's go on. So this is the general process at a high level of how you would apply evidence-based design. It starts with, like Charlie just mentioned, sitting down in a Starbucks and having conversations with actual customers. Observations can come from all different kinds of sources. Google Analytics can come from your search window. It can come from, there's a wonderful platform out there you can use called Hotjar. There are dozens of ways that you can find meaningful or observe patterns and problems and pain points of your customers, and start there with a list of things that you want to try. And then I'm very disciplined about forming a hypothesis, and I'm going to go into a little more detail of what that looks like. When you're doing an A/B test, again, this is a research-based approach. It's a very scientific approach to these solving problems. And so I like to form a very clear hypothesis about what I'm testing, and that can even appear in my case in a very large organization where we have a lot of business use cases and procurement and boards and committees that I have to present these ideas to in many cases, that having a hypothesis statement, what I'm out to solve, how I'm going to solve it, and how I'm going to prove that this is something worth spending money and time on. Having a hypothesis statement is very important. And then we go into experiment design. And design is really it's a twofold process. Part of it's just literally designing what it's going to look like. What's this test? How are users going to interact with this? So I'm a very big advocate of working with user experience designers that know what users that spend a lot of time thinking about how individuals interact with different components on a website. But it also goes to how are we going to design this experiment from a level of effort? What kind of development is going to be needed? Can we smoke screen this? Can we do like a really simple test and just see if people are even interested in this? You can do that on a website. You can use other platforms like usertesting.com. Another one that I've used is the 5secondtest.com. Totally worth checking out. 5-second test lets you throw up a prototype. People observe it for 5 seconds, and then you ask questions about what they observed. Somebody can set up a 5-second test or a usertesting.com test in minutes or hours.
There's sorry. I was going to throw in one of the suggestions we always used to use in one of the big sort of like Google tests for user experience was they call it the 10-foot test. So and it's similar to your 5-second test. If you have your website open on your computer and then you get up out of your chair, walk to the back of the room and look back at the website. So you just can't see the detail. All you can see is like the things that really jump out at you. If you do that is similar to what the experience is like for someone who's arriving at a website and wanting to just fly through it fast. So just literally just getting out of your chair, walking back 10 foot and looking is not a bad starting point for some user experience design testing. So if you don't happen to have any UX design experts in your organization, 10-foot test, I like that one. The 5-second one I'd not heard of. And then one other thing, another tip that I think works really well is if you imagine yourself as a booker, and one of the things I often do when we're testing new things for hotels is I talk aloud. I sound like a crazy person, but I will talk aloud as I go through. I think, okay, I am a parent of 2 and I'm traveling to this location and here's what I want to do. And as I talk and adopt that persona, I find that I just look at the website in a slightly different way and it just forces you to feel and act like a user. So another little inexpensive tip. Sorry, back to you, Justin.
No, I love it. And there are so many effective ways to apply the design phase of evidence-based design. But I love it. I love hearing these other ways to think through and to get out of our own heads. Based on the booking summit in Dallas, the vast majority of the people in the room were revenue management people. And so I think it's easy to get into that mindset of elasticity and measuring seasonality and all of these other really critical parts of what my revenue management team does, and forget what it's like to be the customer on the website. So anything you can do to get out of your frame of reference and into the frame of reference of your customers is incredibly valuable. And so the last part of evidence-based design is the test itself. There are so many great platforms you can use. Google has their own now. Adobe has Target. There's Optimizely. There's custom ways to run tests on a website. But don't forget that even simple things like usertesting.com and walking around the room with a printed out version of your idea just to get a quick feedback can be really valuable for testing whether or not it's even a good idea. So you can apply this process at a very high level at the early stages of idea formation, and then run this at a very detailed level when you're actually putting this in front of thousands of customers. So I'm going to move forward with our case studies now that you've kind of been exposed to this evidence-based design framework. So first case study, of course, I want to talk to what we did with Triptease. So Triptease, we just started with them earlier this year, and we had a number of tests that we wanted to run, and we have to be careful too. Even though we have thousands of transactions a week, we still have to be very mindful about what tests we're running. You don't want to run too many tests at once, where you get what's called cross-pollination, where you have two or three or four tests running on any given page. And it happens in larger organizations when you have such high volume that it can be okay to have those kinds of tests running on one page. But even in our case, we have to be super careful. We have to pick which tests we want to run. And that becomes an exercise in prioritization. Which things do we think we're going to get the most value out of, and which ones we think are going to move the needle from a revenue standpoint. And as we were actually looking through, and we had 4 or 5 tests that we wanted to run earlier this year, and we started looking at TripTease. We ran some smoke screen tests, it's like our first iteration of evidence-based design. We just put on the page an image that showed that rates were in parity. And so we did a quick test to let us actually run through the cycle of what would people be exposed to if they were to see the price check pop-up fly-in that TripTease has, and would this actually move the needle if we had it in the fully featured version that TripTease has. So we initially did a smoke screen test to kind of see if this was going to be valuable, and we saw immediate results from that. So then we moved forward.
Can I just because a smoke screen test is something I think it's very common in the startup world, but just not at all so in hotels. So just to make sure you bring that one to life, what a lot of hoteliers would say, wait a second, you're creating something fake on your website to see if people click it. Doesn't that annoy your users? Why would you do that? That sounds completely counterintuitive.
Right. Let me talk through like a specific use case. So let's say we wanted to test whether or not users on the website actually wanted to engage with chat. Chat's a big feature that a lot of people are looking at. And so one test that we ran was we didn't use actual chat. We had another tool that is on our website. It's an analytics tool that has a polling feature. And so instead of going to the whole process of an RFP and procurement and legal, and again, we're in a gaming, our particular hotel has gaming involved. So from a regulatory standpoint, it's a nightmare to implement new features. So it's really important for us to go through this process to make sure we understand the value. So as we were testing chat, instead of going through that entire procurement legal board process, it's necessary for our hotel, we decided to use an existing tool that was already on the website, and we put a poll up on the website that it looked like chat. And what we did is with our A/B testing platform, we only put a small subset of users that were exposed to that test. So 5% of our users, and I'm going to use round numbers. Let's say in a 2-week period, 10,000 users were exposed to that pop-up, versus, let's say, 2 million that were not. And what that did is that small subset of users were exposed to this little polling tool that looked like chat, and we measured how people interacted with it. And we saw a significant amount of those users interacting with that particular pop-up. So in a matter of hours, we were able to test, the test took about 2 weeks, but within a few hours, we were able to run and start the test, whether or not chat was going to be something that people actually were curious about. Our specific customers would want that. So that's an example of a smokescreen test. Yes, it was fake. We monitored it closely to make sure we weren't getting questions through that polling tool that we needed to answer quickly. But that is an example of how you might smokescreen something. And in our case, it was highly valuable. And we know that, chat's something that people want. So that allowed us to prioritize how are we going to get chat on the website. And of course, in a regulatory environment like ours, it's going to be a long time before we actually do, more than likely.
One other one I've seen from hotels is often there's a long debate about what kind of offer we might want to give people. And you might be thinking of different, maybe we need to give people a discount offer or a free breakfast offer or whatever. And you can run ads on just Google, which link to nowhere. They don't even need to link to anywhere. And you just try them with the different offer text. and you see which one like real people click on, and they instantly found a way to test for, you know, because there's so many things in a sense that are broken on the internet. I think that's why it's okay to run these tests on consumers, because it takes like a millisecond of someone's mind and they've moved on to the next thing. So it doesn't really harm the consumer in a sense.
Yep, and Google's a great way to do that because people will blame Google, not you. So it's a great way to have a kind of a proxy between you and a test. They're not on your website being exposed to something. They're on another website. Well, maybe that website's broken, not the brand that I'm interacting with. So yeah, it's a great example. So moving back to this particular case study, yes, we did smoke screen Triptease to see if there was going to be value in that. We saw that it was moving the needle for the subset of users that we were testing. So we prioritized Triptease. And so we ran this test using the evidence-based design approach here of observation, hypothesis, design, and test. We did notice through different data sources that users were abandoning the funnel to go check in and then booking later with an OTA. And of course, it's very frustrating. It's lost revenue. We already had them on our site, and they were leaving to go check and then booking with the OTA. So the hypothesis was that exposing Triptease fly-in will give users more confidence in our prices, thereby increasing conversion rates and AOV for total revenue increase of greater than 2%. That's very specific. And it's important to have the 2% in there because we know what our costs for Triptease are. We know what our costs for implementing this. We needed to make sure we used a provable hypothesis statement that if we could get greater than 2%, then it justified the costs and us moving forward with Triptease. And these are just example numbers, but I wanted to provide something meaningful and specific to how we applied this. And then in this case, because Triptease already has a wonderful tool that looks great and it works great, we didn't have to design something from scratch. We could lean on Triptease's learning about what works well. And so we didn't have to do a whole lot of design other than to think through what's the level of effort, what are our costs for this, and how well does it have to work to justify moving forward. And so in this case, we used Optimizely to run an A/B test to validate how well this worked. And it actually was a wonderful, fantastic test. It went through the roof. So CR here is conversion rate. AOV is average order value, or ADR is what you'd probably be thinking. And then SS is statistical significance. So in this case, we had an 18, almost 19% conversion rate in one of our channels. Average order value lifted almost 10%, and our statistical significance was 92%. I bring up statistical significance. You folks over in revenue management are probably far more familiar with statistical significance, confidence intervals, more than most people in your organizations will be. In our case, we like to see 90, 92%. If you're a smaller firm, you may be comfortable with 80% statistical significance. And it's easier to get to statistical significance if your conversion rate and your average order values, if you're moving the needle more significantly. And I bring that up because if you're a smaller firm, if you have less than 1,000 transactions per week, you really have to be thinking about how can we move the needle aggressively. You're probably not going to want to waste your time on small feature improvements and copy changes and how will this color work, and if we change the shape of the button, are we going to move the needle? Not to say that those aren't valuable tests to run, but if you're not moving the needle pretty aggressively and you have less than 1,000 transactions per week, for example, if you only get a 10% conversion rate lift with a test and you want to be at 90% confidence, you probably got to move somewhere. Charlie, you could probably do the math in your head. You probably got to move somewhere around 20 to 40,000 people through a test where you're going to get your conversion rates. So it's really important if you're a smaller firm to be thinking big. What big changes can I make? The other way that you can, if you've got a lower volume of transactions, is that you can, instead of trying to do conversion rates from, let's say, the home page of your website all the way through your booking funnel to conversions themselves, you might want to look at how can we get people from the home page into the booking engine. It's what we would call it a micro conversion. No, it's not an actual conversion, but if you're trying to get people from one place to another, actually influence behavior in a measurable way, it's sometimes better to shift your KPI that you're trying to measure from something like conversions to a micro conversion, like I want them to click this button and go to this page. Yeah. So just some thoughts there. As I've had to test, especially in the startup world where we weren't getting hardly any traffic sometimes when we first launched a feature. We had to do anything and everything we could to prove that a particular feature was actually valuable. Another kind of pro tip, I guess, is in the startup space, especially if we wanted to run a test around a particular feature, or we would create a landing page for it and then use social media or Google AdWords to drive traffic to it. And so that gave us a lot of targeted traffic to a specific landing page, and we would bring focus to that feature that we wanted to test. So that's another really valuable way that you can quickly get to statistical significance. And
Justin,
go ahead, Charlie.
Sorry, yeah, just a question, because if I'm going to run a test, and I take your point that particularly for small hotels, they should be looking for big eyes, because I think everyone got very excited in the last 10 years when they heard that Google tested 42 different shades of blue on the Google search page. Testing your button color is a complete waste of time if you're a small hotel, in my view, because you need to be testing things that can have a 10%, 15%, 20% impact, or you won't be able to see the results. But you've shown us here kind of results, and you talked a bit earlier about the hypothesis. What's the reason? If I'm going to run a test and I'm going to get the numbers out the back, why do I need a hypothesis? Why can't I just go run a test? What is it worth that kind of step of articulating it?
Absolutely, and here's why, and here's where some of my experiences led me to the importance of that is, well, first of all, anytime you're going to create a new feature, or you're going to, let's say this is an offer strategy. Offer strategies have a cost. I mean, you're giving people a discount, you're adding new features. Knowing what that cost is for that test you're running, whether it is operational costs, revenue costs, or cost of implementation. For example, I mean, sometimes we have to build new features from scratch. And that involves engaging software developers, designers, and all sorts of folks that have very expensive cost to their efforts. So having a hypothesis statement with a specific shift, move in the needle for revenue in this case, is very important for being able to come back and say this test was a success or was a fail. You can move the needle on tests, and you can have an increase, but if that increase isn't worth the cost, if you're actually going to lose money in implementing something, then why even worry about it? And another aspect of that is, let's say we do a smoke screen test, and we test 4 different things. And of those 4, let's say one of them is very inexpensive for us to implement. It's something like, running a different offer strategy that is just a text change, or we're giving people a breakfast in bed or something. And for the cost of implementation of that is very low. And then and on the flip side of that, let's look at something like chat. Chat's going to be very expensive for us to implement. It's going to take us many, many months of procurement and regulatory red tape to get through and push that across the finish line. So as I would run a smokescreen test, for example, I might see that, well, this particular test that we ran had a 5% lift in revenue and an almost 0 incremental cost for us to deploy it. While another test might have a 7% increase in revenue, but it's going to cost us $500,000 to implement. 7% is a greater revenue move, shift in the needle, but the costs and the time to implement and the speed to market are very different. So having a hypothesis helps you keep centered. It helps you kind of step back and be agnostic about the test, because sometimes it's easy to get emotionally involved. You think a particular idea is going to perform well. It doesn't perform well. You're keeping a bit of an arm's length away from the test and the results of those by starting off early with a hypothesis and saying, this is what it's got to do for us to move forward with implementing this fully. So does that answer the question? Is that what you were looking for there, Charlie?
Yeah, perfect. And also another challenge, I guess, for hotels is, sorry to stop you from taking your drink, is there are so many things you could do. You know, changing images, adding new widgets on your website, changing the user flow. How do you go about? You know, if you've got 50 different things flowing in your mind, how do you decide what to work on next? I guess it's a similar to what you've been talking about.
Right. You know, it's a pain point for sure. It's a challenge to prioritize. And thinking through like the level of effort, how difficult is this particular test? How much is it going to cost us to implement this thing? Is a necessary phase of an evidence-based design. I think of the test that kind of started this entire industry, or at least the vernacular and language around it, with evidence-based design in hospitals, was a doctor observed that when there were patients that were exposed to natural light with a window, that they were able to, they had better patient outcomes. They recovered more quickly, and they came back less frequently to get care later. Now, if you think about a hospital, it's already been built, and you can't just add windows willy-nilly. And it's very similar to some of the challenges that we face in our industry. Some of the things that we want to do and the tests that we want to run are not easy to implement in a production environment. So taking the time to think through that level of effort and prioritize what we think is actually going to move the needle the most will help organize that list of things that you actually want to test.
Yeah.
So that's a very valuable exercise. And kind of the more granular piece of that is the hypothesis statement, where you've actually taken the time. What is this going to cost us? And how much do we need to move the needle for us to justify moving forward with fully implementing this? So
I know that our what we do as a tech business is our development team every month. They're literally force ranking. Here are all the experiments we'd like to run, or here are the things we'd like to build, and they score from like 1 to 10 on effort, and they score from 1 to 10 on potential impact. And then, you know, we go after things that are low effort, high impact, or maybe might be investments in the future and a high effort, but are worth it because the impact could be huge. But just the process of force ranking, I think, is something that not enough people do. I know particularly our product managers like the process of force ranking because they can hold it up to senior management, and next time senior manager goes, oh, I've got this crazy idea. My wife said, can we do this, please? They go, well, look, let's just rank it on expected effort and expected outcome and see if it beats the other things. Because if it beats everything, sure, I'll put it at the top of the agenda. But if it doesn't, then we don't even need to argue about whether we do it. It's very obvious to both of us. There's a ranked list, there's an order, there's a process, and we have a system. I think that really helps alleviate some of the stress that can come from people saying, because everybody has a view on your website, right? Everybody says, can we do this? Can we do that? And it can be stressful to have to manage it.
Right. You know, and it happens. You know, I get dictated to what we are going to implement on a regular basis. And so when that happens, in 95% of the cases, I will put that through an A/B test, even if it's a small subset of users that are getting exposed to the original, because it lets me come back later and say, hey, that ended up being a really great idea. Let me show you the test results. And what it lets me do within my organization, socialize the changes and the science, the scientific approach that we're taking to the user experience. And so when a test does really well and it's somebody else's idea, and we've been able to show that it was, fantastically successful, they love going and socializing their idea. And now what they're really doing is talking about what the approach that we're taking here to making sure that every little thing that we do is measured and carefully crafted. So another test that I wanted to run through real fast is we made an observation through one of our many different tools that we use to monitor website traffic, that there was a UI element within our mobile interface that people were interacting with. Well, they thought when they interacted with it that it was a button, but it really wasn't a button. It was just a little symbol on the page. And so as we observed that people were interacting with this element, We went back into our analytics and found out that 22% of mobile users were trying to click on this thing. And so changing it into a button was super easy for us to do. If people thought it was a button, well, we could make it a button. And that was a very easy thing to do. And it's important to call that out because this hypothesis statement here, you'll see that we can improve revenue by greater than 0.25%. That's a very small move because it was a very easy change to make. The level of effort for us to implement this feature, to turn that little element on the page into a button was trivial. I think it was less than 2 hours of work for a developer to go change that. So the hypothesis statement would reflect that it's so easy for us to make that change that we didn't need to move the needle very much to make it work. So, and in our case here, I'm just going to go right to the results. We saw very quickly that a conversion rate went up to was 5%. Average order value was 5.82% with a statistical significance of 80%. Now, when I let our vendor know that a lot of users were trying to interact with this element that wasn't actually a button, they started running their own tests. And because they had millions of more visitors in a month or a week than we did, they were able to get statistical significance on their side. So what ended up happening was that they went ahead and made the change before our test was done, and we had zero cost to implement this. So by running a quick smokescreen test, we were able to prove to our third-party vendor that this was a very successful change that needed to be made, and they went and made it on behalf of us. We didn't have any cost to roll this out. So that's an example of how powerful a scientific approach can be. If you've got a lot of vendors, and as most of us do, we're a very fragmented industry that has a lot of different moving parts and a lot of data siloed in different places. But this approach can help us influence our vendors, where we sometimes have a difficult time getting these vendors to listen to our ideas. I'm sure you have vendors that manage different pieces of your website or your booking engine where you're saying, I wish this feature was available, but getting their attention can be very difficult. It can be tough to get them to listen to your idea. And so if you run a test and you see that our change will move the needle, not just for us, but for your other clients, they're much more likely to make that change for you. So it's another way, and I wanted to use this case study to show how this approach can help you influence your vendors to prioritize what you want changed when you find that they're not listening to you, or maybe you want them to make a change and they'll tell you, yeah, 6-7 months from now we might get to that in their product roadmap. So using this approach can be very effective.
So I should say thank you on behalf of all Travel Tripper clients who also now benefit from your change that you drove.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's to you all's credit as different Travel Tripper, especially that when we do make these kinds of changes, we do socialize and articulate it to them, and they listen. That's right. And you do the same thing with us. We how aggressive we are about measuring our tests and our website traffic. So when we do bring you information, you're able to adjust quickly. So and that's just an important part of what working with good partners is about. So
yeah. And it's great. And I think that was you mentioned before. They turned around really fast, which is great to hear. Can I just out of interest, because your initial hypothesis in that one was based on the fact that you said you saw 22% of people clicking on it. So that's something I'm assuming you got from Heatmap. You were watching people on the website.
Right. Yeah. There are a couple of different tools out there that will let you get a heat map or do other types of measuring how people are interacting with an interface. In this case, it was not a heat map, but a heat map is a different tool that I might have used to see, just quickly at a glance, how many people are interacting with a particular element. So tools like Hotjar are a good example of heat map and scroll maps.
One that I know that our team absolutely love is Full Story, which is like a video. So it videos everybody's actions, and then it doesn't make you don't have to watch every customer, but it then automatically works out which customers had an interesting experience, so that the product, so that you can watch what happened. And then even better, it also has this thing called click rage. So if it ever finds that there are people on the website who are like madly, furiously clicking something because they think it should respond, it'll like just let you know. But it's a really nice way of watching videos rather than just sort of looking at the heat map. Anyway, thank you. That was a great case study.
Yeah, it was good for us, and it kind of goes back to that. You've got to take the time. You got to have people willing to take the time in your organization to go through that observation stage. I think it's super easy sometimes to only look at the end of the funnel and say what conversions are happening here, and how many people are actually swiping the card. I think it's really important to have people like product managers within an organization who are taking the time to do the observation. I'm actually going to switch over if I can. I think it's here. Yes. Is my screen still showing up?
Yep, absolutely.
And you can see this is an infographic that's actually available through the link within this presentation. So please take it, download it, print it, whatever you want to do with it. But I tailored this for folks that have a lower click rate, for example. But I wanted to call out a couple of tools for observation. Hotjar.com, of course, is a great one for heat maps and things like that. Usertesting.com is a great tool for quickly validating ideas, along with like 5-second tests and things like that. But another common approach that I take is I look at outside industry innovation. And what are other industries doing? Like airline is a great industry to look at, see some of the features and tools that they're using. But you can also find things in the medical space and in finance tech. And so I spend a little bit of time. I wish I could spend more, but I try to spend at least an hour a week reading studies from other organizations or other industries rather, who are finding ways to move the needle and trying different things. And it helps me kind of build a list of tools of things that I may want to test. And so, but there are a lot of really great places. We have some wonderful industry journals that are out there. But I like to lean more and more on outside industry innovation and different publications that you just find random things you just wouldn't have thought of, and they're trying different stuff. So that and just sitting around watching customers, how are they interacting? You just can't beat that. Like watching people. I have a 10 and an 8-year-old, and they are usually my first people that I will have test something. So I will smoke screen something and have my kids come over there and say, hey, what does this thing do? And they'll talk me through it, or they'll interact with it. And in our case, we have a lot of users who are 60 and older. And so it's a great way to kind of get a sense of what, if my kids are seeing something, it's a good kind of initial test of how our specific users are going to do something. So don't be afraid to engage the child labor. The kids love to be engaged. So
I think, and actually, I'd say this. It's actually a really important point, because if you're sitting in your hotel with a bunch of like digital natives who spend their entire time online, and yet your hotel is catering to people who might be in their 70s and perhaps didn't grow up in a computer first world at school and everything else, then testing whether it's with kids or whether it's with people in at the other end of the spectrum, I think is really important, because it's very easy to assume that everyone is like you, and sometimes good to get a different point of view.
Right. Well, and I think too, it's easy to fixate on pain points, but another thing that I try to orient my brain to when I'm thinking these things through is I'm trying to anticipate needs. If I can solve problems before they become problems, if I can figure out ways to delight our customers in a way that nobody else has even thought about yet. One, it creates competitive advantage, but it also it gives me a lot of other stuff, and there's a lot of fun for me to actually try to solve problems before they're actually problems. So these are some of the tools that I use as I'm going through that process of observing, and I really want to highlight the importance of it. And then hypothesis is something I spend like sometimes just as little as 15 minutes on, but it's a really important exercise. And again, just using this infographic, design has two phases to it, and it's not just the level of effort, and it's not just user experience itself. It's really kind of a twofold process in there, and then testing it carefully. So, please leverage this. I think especially as a lot of firms, a lot of people on this call are probably in revenue management. This isn't something that you have a ton of time to sit around and do. You've got very important other aspects of the business to measure and monitor. And so having kind of a cheat sheet to run with and just jump in, you've got some extra time on the flight, go through some industry journals, something like that. A great way to just kind of quickly keep your brain fresh and thinking through from your customer's point of view. So cool. We've got about 15 minutes left. Do we want to open this up to some questions, or?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest exactly the same. Someone just said that there's maybe a bit of noise in but I think we're fixed now. That's okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, there is. Please feel free if you want to type in a question, and I'll be able to ask Justin about that. And while we wait to see if there are any that have come, I'm interested to hear whether, having moved from the world of just pure digital and startups and the like into hospitality, what have been your reflections on what hotels are doing well or could be doing better in digital?
Right. I think it's important to call out that I am in a very specific industry. I think I've got an echo. Is that me?
It was a little bit of an echo. Yeah, that's okay now.
Okay. Sweet. Okay, great. I'm in Las Vegas, and of course it's a travel destination. A lot of our sales are around group. We have a lot of regulatory challenges because of gaming. So I know that's very different probably than some of the other folks on this call. But one observation that I've made, or there's a couple, I guess. One is how siloed the data is. You've got data over here in one vendor. You've got data in this other system. You've got other sets of data that are very highly regulated. You can't use it for certain systems. And that could be a significant challenge that in other technology industries, high tech, health tech, that there were similarities, but it's not the data wasn't nearly as fragmented.
Yeah.
That's one big observation that I think this industry has a long way to go to unsilo a lot of that data. The other one is like a shift in product thinking. I have not seen a lot of digital product managers within this space, people who actually own the booking engine or e-commerce platforms, and that's their job. Just sit around and focus on how can we make this better. My observation has been that revenue management are often tasked with, whether directly or indirectly, the role of trying to make the booking engine work better. Yeah. And that's rough. That's rough because there's a lot of other things to be focusing on that are critical to the business. And it takes a lot of time, as this methodology hopefully highlights, to really think through solutions and make things better. So that's something I'd like to see the industry shift more towards.
Yeah.
Is more product.
And so, and picking up on what you said earlier about getting inspiration, I know a lot of hotels go and watch what the OTAs do and try and focus so that they can narrow down the options on things they could try on their own website. They go and say, oh, I saw Booking roll this out, and so I'll replicate it. I guess people should also be looking at what you roll out and replicate it. If it doesn't, if it's not automatically coming to them from a vendor. There's a question from Calvin Fu. Hi, Justin. I'd like to know if you set a cutoff time if you think a test is taking too long to get to significance. So will you cut a test short? How do you decide to do that?
Right. I think that's a great question. So when I start a test, I watch it very closely. You kind of have to step back for the first few days and let some people get exposed to it. But if I don't see that separation of conversion rate or whatever KPI I'm trying to measure pretty quickly, then I may pull the trigger and pull the test. And it's happened. I could say probably about 20% of my tests I've done that too. Part of it is I've got a lot of tests to do. And if my hypothesis, for example, is that I need to move 5%, I need to see a 5% conversion rate, and I'm only seeing like a 3% lift, then at some point, yeah, my statistical significance may be pretty low. But if I'm not moving the needle pretty aggressively, pretty quickly on some expensive tests, it's gone. So because I have 20 others I need to run.
Yeah.
So yes, I will pull the trigger on just, yanking a test if I do see that it's not moving the needle quickly.
Yeah.
And some of that is based on the test.
It's a tough one. I know that our data science team are just like forever, never look at a test until like you've got it all in, because otherwise it's amazing how they can shift. But yeah, you've got to be commercial about it. A few more questions. What are some of the challenges, or how do you deal with the challenge of syncing up your tests with, other things marketing or revenue management teams might be doing? Because if they're running new promotions and stuff, how do you sync up your work?
Conversations. Lots of meetings.
Right.
It's a challenge that I face in any other organization that I've been in. Is there are a lot of strategic push and pull, a lot of different ideas, and it's very common that you just got to have the conversations. And so again, though, when I've done the hypothesis, when I've designed a test well, I can articulate in those conversations why I think this test over that test might be more valuable. But yeah, it does take a lot of conversation, coordination, and where I'm at today, there are strategic shifts that happen. We just have to we got to pull the test, and that's just reality. So it just takes the conversation to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That's it for questions, I think. But there was one last request. Oh no, there's a couple. One was from Emery, who asks, Justin, please could you serenade us at the end of the webinar? I think he sees the guitar behind you. You can have a think about that for a moment while I ask you a couple others that just came in. Another question is, product management is more a startup role. What would be your recommendation to convince hotel management to adapt and create such a role? I guess it's a challenge if you're not of scale.
Yeah, it definitely is a challenge if you don't have the scale. I mean, if you can't afford to bring on a product manager with a tech background, it doesn't mean you can't work with one as a vendor. Some of the vendors, conversion rate optimization firms and such often have people that are thinking about these things and hopefully have experience in those areas. So what I would argue is that if we don't collectively as an industry begin thinking in terms of product, we're going to see the OTAs continue to push us around, and they're going to continue to capture market share. Now, OTAs are not our enemy. They are an important part of our revenue mix. So I don't want to go like demonize them, but they have a strong incentive to get more and more of that market share. So if collectively as an industry we're not adapting and taking on a product mindset, it doesn't matter. We have 10,000 rooms that here in Las Vegas, but we're a drop in the bucket. It doesn't matter how great we are. If we're not collectively great as an industry, we're going to lose market share to these different to the OTAs. So that would be my argument ultimately. It's adapt or die.
Yeah. Okay. I'm afraid. You're back. So I think that's it. We're going to draw it to a conclusion. I leave it to you as to whether or not you decide to, for the first time ever, serenade us out of a webinar. But I would. How
about an accompanying video? I might.
Okay. We might put a link to any YouTube videos you might have.
There we go.
Good. So, look, I just want to say thank you so much. I think it's really important that hoteliers look a little bit outside the industry sometimes to see what the best practice is, and particularly when we're living in such a data-rich world, the importance of having a simple but structured approach to hypothesis and testing, I think is really key. And I suspect for a hotelier, it's also really helpful at the end of the year to be able to say, to your boss, to the management, look, this year, these are the experiments we wanted to run. These are the things we've tried. 20 of them worked, 10 didn't. But this is the process. It's just a really clear, simple process. So thank you so much for that, Justin. And hopefully you'll get loads of visitors from the webinar to see you in Las Vegas when you start playing, live there very soon.
That's my side gig, my side hustle.
Well, yeah, we'll put a link to tickets where you can buy tickets at the bottom. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Charlie, thank you. It's always a pleasure.